So this presentation is regarding adopting App ID and why you should want to. Okay? So much like the NAT presentation, I think it's important to define what we're talking about before we start talking about it. So what is App ID? So in a nutshell, App ID refers to the capability of PAN-OS to uniquely identify applications that traverse the firewall through its deep content inspection features. Okay? So it goes beyond basic port and protocol metrics of a traditional firewall. Most of the time, like when it comes to like old school firewalls, you just like, all right, TCP port 80, let's roll. You just do port protocol rules. It is one of several traffic match conditions in PAN-OS policy. Okay, so if you remember from the NAT presentation, every policy, including security, has traffic match conditions. App ID is one of those when it comes to security. It is one of the many metrics that can be used symbiotically with others to enhance your security posture. Okay? Now, I know that kind of sounds like marketing buzzwords, but it's absolutely true. App IDs, they're traffic signatures that are updated weekly with our content and application updates. Okay? As an administrator, you have the ability to schedule when you actually want to, whether to install the new App ID updates, or you can make sure they have to be a certain age before you can install them. And there's a very good reason for doing that, because when it comes to App ID signatures, okay, remember we're going beyond port and protocol here. So occasionally, vendors will update their application before we update our signature for it. And sometimes that can break things because they don't notify us. Other times there might be like a typo or something in the content that we're looking for. Usually whenever that happens, it's fixed within 24 hours. So my recommendation, if you're going to automatically download and install app and content updates, is to make sure there's a 48-hour threshold. As long as you accept, wait 48 hours before you install them, you're usually pretty good. The other thing too is if you like to run out-of-date applications, and then we update our signature to be like a more modern version of that, that may be a good compelling reason to hold back that particular application signature and not update it, because a new signature could theoretically break that. So why use App ID? So traditional firewalls that utilize port and protocol for their traffic match conditions, and that's pretty much the only thing they inspect on, it's turning out that that's pretty insufficient to protect your environments from modern day threats. Okay? People who develop malware and cyber criminals, they're not stupid. Okay, like it's pretty much like a war of attrition between security vendors and malicious actors. Okay, they will obfuscate data. They will make sure that whatever programs that they can get installed in your environment, they'll make sure that if it talks to like C2 servers or anything of that nature, it's going to do it over well-known ports that you're probably going to let out. I can't tell you how many times I've seen very weird-looking traffic going out over UDP 53. Because who's going to block DNS, right? You block DNS, your network doesn't work. Many applications also utilize dynamic port allocation. Okay, so if I have an application that tries to communicate outbound to a server somewhere, it may not always use the same destination ports every single time. So if you're using a traditional port protocol firewall, how do you make a policy that allows that traffic to get there? Okay, I can't. So as a consultant, remember. One of the things I said when I was doing my introduction, I've seen some things. I've seen lots of traditional port protocol policies that are pretty much port range 1 through 65,535 UDP TCP on allow policies. So basically that system's wide open. If it opens up a session somewhere, the return flow is going to go right back over whatever port you allow. So App ID helps alleviate this problem by going one step further. It's not just looking at layer 3 and 4 data, like IP address port. It's looking at layers 5 through 7. So it's inspecting things like session headers. It's looking at the contents of the session payload, destination URLs, and certificate attributes. It's actually another interesting thing that it does. So what you're looking at right there, I'm sure many of you have already seen something like that. That's just a simple Wireshark capture. But as you can see, there's a lot more data in there than just IP address and ports, right? So that's where App ID really comes in. Okay, it's basically inspecting the contents of those sessions for keywords, for regular expressions, for basically just identifying fingerprint type characteristics of traffic as it flows through your network. So App ID is a traffic match condition. So I just want to call this out here. So when it comes to the traffic match condition aspect of policies, it is an and operation. You guys know the difference between and or, right? So essentially, all the conditions must be true for a traffic session to hit that policy. So when it comes to that, I'm talking specifically about app ID and service objects. Okay, so service objects in PAN-OS terminology, that is our port protocol. Okay, we can still do port protocol rules, you know, if it gives you the warm and fuzzies and you still want to keep doing it. But if you use app ID in combination with that, that will be the conditions that get matched. So where this comes into play, okay, we have a service object called application default. Okay, that is a predefined object, and what that means is, hey Palo Alto, you have an app ID signature for my application. Okay, I'm using application default for the ports. So what that means is whatever our signature data is for that specific application, it's going to use the default ports for that. So a prime example is SSH. Okay, what port does SSH run on?
22.
Exactly, 22. Okay. So what happens if you have an enterprising, system developer and they want to host SSH on a high port, non-standard configuration, and I use my SSH app ID? How do I make that work? Say they're hosting it on port 23,861. Pardon? Exactly. You have to use it in conjunction with a service object. So you would use SSH plus a port object, which is TCP and whatever that high port I just said is. Okay, so that in mind, there are some considerations that you want to take into account before you adopt app ID. You have a question?
Let me make sure I got this. So
Okay.
you have to basically open the port and add the higher layer filtering.
Exactly. So you use the app ID in conjunction with the service port. So for the example that I just gave with SSH, if I was going to allow SSH from source to whatever the destination is, and we're just talking about the app ID and the port there, I would use a combination of SSH app ID as well as application default, which is that predefined object. So basically what that says is, okay, use the Palo Alto app signature to allow that particular traffic through. So if SSH is attempted to be opened on any other port than 22, the firewall would reject that session, or it would cause it to not match that policy until it goes down until it hits a policy that it does match. Does that make sense?
And so application default is a service object.
Right. It is a service object, so it is a port protocol
Whichever
condition.
service object
We're going to
would
switch
be
back to your
appropriate.
flow logic.
Sure.
Explain it via-
Yeah, we'll do that. All right, so Ben's going to go to the flow logic diagram here from the previous presentation. Okay, so app ID is looked at in flow 3. But if you look at the pre-policy, so it's checking the allowed ports, okay? So basically, application default is an allowed ports object, okay? Whereas the app ID itself is the other unique characteristics, like the layer 5 through 7 characteristics of that application. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm just gonna click through this real fast.
So if I want to do SSH on two different ports, on a standard port and a non-standard port, would I need two different rules for that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want it,
Because if I say
or
application default,
well,
I can't add
well, here's the thing. If you wanted to do it on a standard port, you've got two options. Either you can make two policies and have one of them be application default and the other one your custom port, or you could actually make a port object called TCP22 as well as your custom port and then host it. You put both of those in the same policy.
But you still have to uncheck the default.
Yeah.
box.
As soon as you,
Yeah.
as soon as you
Yeah,
select
default.
a service object, it will move to the application default.
Yes.
It does, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
yeah.
as soon as you add a custom port object, it'll do that. But
Yeah.
yeah, but if you put multiple ports in there, so basically each column is an or, but the whole row is an and.
Yeah.
Okay, if that makes sense.
So that's also another key thing to remember, because I got bit by this when I first started dealing with this, is if you say I want to allow SSH and you add a port, that immediately means 22, the default action is no longer valid, so you have to include that as well.
Right. Okay. So are you good on application default versus custom ports? All right. Cool. All right. So I left off. Okay, I left off right there. So before adopting App ID in your environment, you should ask yourself this series of questions and answer them. Very important to answer your own questions here. So, actually, I'm just going to go to the next slide because it's the same questions. So, question number 1 is, does the existing firewall policy base contain a large quantity of port and protocol traditional style firewall rules? And the answer is most likely going to be yes if you're a fairly new Palo Alto customer and you have migrated off of traditional firewall to us. So the reason this question is important, okay, I'm just going to show you guys my answers to these questions. So if yes, the reason this is important is you could be allowing unintended traffic through the firewall. Okay, so based on the discussion I was talking about earlier, you know, malware developers are not stupid. They're going to use well-known ports if they're going to be exfiltrating data, or if they're going to be, you know, making calls back to like command and control servers or things of that nature. So once you have App ID, I mean, the firewall will look for App ID by default. So like if you look in your traffic monitor, if you have port protocol-based policies, you will actually see an App ID column in your traffic monitor that'll show you what applications are being observed. So it can actually be very eye-opening if you're a new Palo customer and you go to that monitor tab and filter on one specific rule. Say the intention of that rule was just to allow things like web browsing out port 80 or something like that. You'll notice that we have a ton of signatures for browser-based applications. You'll see things like Spotify or Facebook or Twitter, or, you know, just there's all kinds of stuff. Also, what's interesting is if you have a policy that allows DNS, but it's UDP 53 and not the application signature for DNS, if you see anything other than DNS, bad news. So that's really where App ID comes into play there. The other question you should ask yourself is, does my environment contain a lot of encrypted traffic? The reason that is important is because we cannot inspect what we cannot decrypt. Okay? The whole purpose of encryption is to hide what is being transferred. You know, otherwise, anyone who has a packet sniffer would be able to figure out what is in that session. So, a PAN-OS firewall can actually do SSL decrypt. Okay, and the way it does it is it's essentially a man-in-the-middle attack. You have a trusted certificate that is a certificate authority certificate. Your sessions will pass through the firewall. The firewall will see that it's an HTTPS session, and it will replace whatever certificate was in the original session with like the trusted one. It essentially completes the first SSL handshake, and then it will complete that SSL handshake with the destination server, and you will be able to inspect the decrypted traffic. So SSL decrypt will be necessary to gain visibility into that traffic. However, if you are an early adopter of App ID, but you're not doing SSL decryption, and you have some App ID policies that are allowing things that are just like straight up SSL, you will be in for a rude awakening when you start decrypting that SSL traffic, because now you're actually seeing all of the applications that are actually there. So if your policy base is not updated to reflect all of the actual applications that are within that existing SSL session, then you could unintentionally block traffic. Very important to understand that SSL decryption will start breaking things open, and you'll start seeing way more App IDs than you previously did. We absolutely recommend using SSL decrypt because, again, you cannot see what you cannot decrypt. Yes?
We have a pretty cool example of that. So we had a PC at a guard shack, and they had some kind of like truck software that would monitor where trucks were going, delivering precious metals. So it was like a security thing. And there was Google Maps on the page. So we allowed the domain for this PC to get their SSL, but the map wasn't being displayed until we decrypt the session. Then we saw Google Maps as an app, allowed that, and then it worked.
Yep.
So Google Maps was hidden inside the SSL. The page would load, they'd log in, but it was just a blank page.
Right, but I'm assuming you were not allowing Google Maps previously, and that's why it wasn't displaying?
Correct. And once we decrypted, when we broke up that SSL session, then we could see Google Maps and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite eye-opening, and it probably will create some support case issues like that, but once you get it tuned, it's great, because then you can really break down what you actually want to allow versus just opening up the floodgates on a port. So that pretty much covers why you want to use, why the encryption question is important. So the next one here is, are there any custom, special purpose, or in-house developed applications that are kind of like niche to your organization? And if yes, are these critical to your line of business? And you can take a pretty good guess as to why this question is important. Because these questions are intended to discover whether to do an application override or make a custom application signature. If you guys have any like kind of custom applications that are not really well known to the outside world, We probably don't have an application signature for that. You know, we're willing to work with companies to develop application signatures, but I mean, obviously there's a lot of organizations out there that have things like trade secrets, and there's just no way that they would share that information with us to show how the application works. So there's a couple of options here. So what I mean by application override versus custom app ID. We give you the capability of developing your own application signatures. Application signatures can be very like esoteric to develop. I mean, there's a lot of data that has to go into making a signature. You have to take a lot of PCAPs, and if it's a client-server-based application, you have to get flows from both the client and the server so the firewall can uniquely identify that kind of stuff. And it's a little bit of an endeavor, but it pays off because now you know exactly what kind of traffic that is. So if you start seeing traffic that doesn't match, you know, what that application needs to function, you know that, you know, maybe somebody's trying to attack it, or maybe somebody's trying to run some, you know, like some Kali Linux tools against it or something like that. You might have an attack from within. So that covers like the custom app ID. Now application override, what this does is application override is a separate set of policies, okay? So there will be a traffic match condition, but essentially what application override does, it allows you to override whatever application is observed on a particular traffic flow, and you can override it with whatever application you want. So a prime example of when I would use application override. Can anyone tell me from a networking and Wireshark perspective, what is the difference between SSH and SFTP? There's really not.
There isn't.
Yeah,
Over
it's- yeah,
22, you get the key handshake, and the rest of the traffic's encrypted.
Yeah, SFTP is simply just FTP over SSH. So from the firewall's perspective, all it sees is SSH, right? So let's say I have a big cluster of database servers, and I've got to do very large file transfers over SFTP, but all of a sudden I'm noticing that my several terabyte file transfers are just dying mid-flight sometimes. The reason being is that there are default session timeout values for applications, and this is a global value on the firewall. Okay, so unless you modify that globally, which you probably don't want to, you have to make...
We actually have an example of that too.
SAP.
We migrated our SAP instance to the cloud, to an infrastructure as a service. And once we migrated, we actually had a Apollo in front of the data center, and we were getting calls that sessions were just disconnecting. So like people would come in the morning, log into SAP, walk away, do their job, come back, fill orders out, stuff like that. We actually had to modify the firewall's default timers to not reset the session, because it was kicking users off of SAP while they were filling out forms.
Okay, so, but you set that at the global level?
On the firewall.
On the firewall? Okay. So what you may want to do is maybe revisit that and make an application override policy. So essentially, what application override, the benefit that gives you over doing it globally on the firewall, is that you can specify it to a specific traffic flow. So if you've got known destinations, you can basically set the traffic pattern in the override to a custom application that you make that basically just has like an infinite timeout value.
Do you name that application? So you could do like SAP dash,
Yeah.
custom or something.
Exactly. You could call it like app SAP or something like that, and then
Oh,
you could.
do you just clone the application then?
You could clone it. You could clone the existing app ID if there is one, but chances are you'll probably. Sorry, was that?
SAP does have an app ID.
Okay. Yeah, I think that one's a fairly recent one because I remember SAP was that was giving some of our customers trouble in the past.
Maybe not that recent, because we implemented that like a year plus ago. But that's we did run into that.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, try to revisit that and maybe see if an application override policy would be a better option there. So yes.
We did an application override for our multi-factor through CyberArk. Radius was timing out. So we have an application override for Radius 120, so it gives you 2 minutes of timeout versus the default.
Exactly. So
yes, in 8.1, one of the features added in 8.1 was custom timeout variables for applications.
For existing application
For existing
signatures?
applications.
Okay,
Is
that's
one of
actually
the-
good because I actually did not know that.
Yeah, that was one of the
That's
features
actually-
added in
yeah.
8.1.
Okay.
Well, something that we've done, I know Ken worked with us in the past on this, was that we, instead of cloning the app, we create a custom app, but you set the parent app as
The existing?
So
Yeah.
Oracle, for example, their lovely code and connections for some of the vendors that use them are really crappy. So we run out of timeout issues. So instead of just creating new app, we just use that as a parent, and then set the timeout values in that new parent. So that way we don't have to capture traffic.
Okay, that's a good idea.
So,
Yeah, and I've actually had a similar situation. I was actually doing a cutover for a customer, and the industry that this customer was in, they had like an application that was custom in-house built, but on the back end, it was actually I don't know why it was designed this way, but essentially what happened is an employee would launch this application, and on the back end, it would reach out to a cluster of SQL servers, and it would do like a 17 gigabyte file transfer just to launch the application.
Jeez.
Yeah, I have no idea what was going on that back end, but essentially we were running into session timeout problems like that because the application was still functioning. It was just in a degraded state because ordinarily it would take them like 10 seconds or so to log in, and after they upgraded to us, it took like 2.5 minutes for a user to log in, so they were complaining. But once we figured it out, we had to do an application override on that database call to just increase the timeout value for MS SQL, and it worked.
a lot of the software too we found wasn't advertised by the vendors. Once we dug deeper, there was actually keep alive variables that you can set. So instead of doing a bunch of overrides just for timeouts, I would check the app to make sure that you can do a keep alive, especially for a session. Set that before you do the override.
That's a good call too, because otherwise, if you do an override, you may actually unintentionally leave that session hanging open, longer than you intended. So, yes.
Now, do those log as age outs in the session end reason? The
Yes.
Application override?
Yeah, it'll say, well, application overrides don't log as
So
age
that's
outs.
The timeout issues, those logs just age out?
Yeah. So if you're looking at your traffic logs, there's very important distinctions that you need to make. So just because you see age out in a session doesn't necessarily mean that it's a timeout issue. For instance, when it comes to UDP versus TCP, TCP will always send a thin packet or a reset or something to tell you, hey, this session's over. UDP just stops. So a UDP session will always age out, whereas a TCP session, if you see TCP aging out, that's your indication that there's most likely a problem.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that's how those show up.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes?
I had one more question about app ID. So if you have a port-based rule,
Mhm.
but you have IDS/IPS rules to reset sessions, is there any benefit of having applications, or is that just more granular in your conditions, right?
It's more granular in your conditions, really.
So that's really what it's giving you is that a level of insight.
So with the application override, the other thing that goes into that is application overrides don't hit the security profiles. So if you've got
That's true.
security profiles, antivirus profiles, threat profiles,
Yeah.
and you're overriding something like SAP,
Mhm.
and you want to be able to protect
Yeah.
that traffic, that's why you want to modify the settings in the application ID that are in 8.1 instead of using that app override,
Good
because
call.
it won't go into the lower security processing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's,
yeah.
because at Materion, we strictly use app ID for everything. I think we may have one rule specifically with port, everything else is app ID.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we definitely use IDS/IPS security profiles for all of the policies as well. So I've always wondered, does it give you any benefit of having app ID or not? Sounds like no, but it sounds like yes in a way. 'Cause
Well-
if you use custom,
Yeah, if you use a custom app signature and your app signature is accurate, then don't do app override. However, like pretty much app override, the main use case for app override is if you have an application where you just physically do not have the time because you have so many other duties to actually develop a custom app signature, that you just want to put it on, like, that is one thing, I don't know if everyone in the room heard this, but he brought up an interesting point, is that whenever you do application override, it puts the traffic in what's called the network fast path. Okay, so essentially app override will just make it a layer 3-4 thing. It's not going to do the app ID inspection or if you have like security profiles such as like antivirus or wildfire or anything like that, it will actually not apply to app override traffic. So very important to understand that as well. But app override is pretty much, the only time you want to use that is just when you know for sure, I have a traffic pattern that needs to be matched and I don't have an app signature for it and it just needs to work, make an app override rule. If you have the time to develop a custom app signature, I recommend doing it. Any more questions so far, or should I move on here? Okay. So we already covered this, but are there traffic flows that perform large file transfers? And that it's basically the timeout value. That's the use case there. So once you get the answers to those questions, how do you adopt App ID? How do I go from a layer 3 to 4 policy base to an App ID layer 7 enabled policy base? A couple ways to do it. You can do it manually. It is the most time consuming, but in my opinion, there is a benefit to doing it this way because it's very educational. Okay, so essentially what you do is you would create custom reports that go through all of your policies, and it looks, you look at the traffic logs for each one of those policies. Because if you have just port protocol rules, you want to know what applications are actually being allowed through by those, right? So you would make these custom reports, you'd run it over a specific time period, and you would see what all has been observed by a rule, okay? So you audit the reports, and you make decisions on what applications should be allowed or disallowed by the policy. Okay, so for instance, if I have a policy that is, it's supposed to allow DNS, that's the only thing it's supposed to allow. But the old legacy rule was just UDP or TCP over 53. But then you start seeing like other applications besides DNS, you know that, okay, those other applications are not sanctioned, so I would make a DNS rule for that, right? So it can be eye-opening, and it is a little more time-consuming. The other option is you can actually do it in a semi-automated fashion, okay? So Palo Alto Networks has a tool called Expedition, and this is available from the live community. Like any one of you could just go out there and download it. But essentially, Expedition is the replacement to the migration tool, if any of you have used that in the past. So with Expedition, you can actually connect it directly to your Panorama or your firewalls, and you can actually have it read the logs. Okay, so when you connect it as like a log connector, you go to your policy base, and you can actually look at all of the security policies there, and you can actually fetch the app IDs that those policies have observed. So this is good. However, I do recommend if you have an extremely large policy base and you have very busy logs, you may want to kind of tone down the time frame that you look up, because ordinarily my recommendation is 30 days. But if you have like 1,500 rules, okay, you might actually overload the VM that Expedition is hosted on. So you might want to do it in just blocks. Okay. So what's really nice there is you can actually convert the rules in place with the migration tool there with Expedition. So if I have port protocol rules and it observes all these app IDs, there's actually a function. It's simple as just right-clicking, going to app ID, and then replace app ID, and it'll replace all the ports. It'll replace the port protocol with the app IDs that were observed. Yes.
So is Expedition an application you install, or is it like an OVA template you?
It's an OVA.
Okay.
So Expedition is an OVA. It's essentially an Ubuntu 16.04 server, but it runs a custom web server that has. It's essentially a tool that is designed to ingest PAN-OS configurations and third-party vendor configurations, and you can actually do conversions to PAN-OS.
Actually, a VMDK.
It's a VMDK?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you try to open it up with like VirtualBox, it will crash. There is a custom OVA out there, but I've had problems with it.
Okay. When was the last time that you downloaded a version of it?
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago? Okay, so that's probably still in the same state then. Yeah.
This is VMware Review.
Okay.
So I do it exactly for this to review our rules, see which ones are we can update.
Okay, so yeah, it is. So it's a VMDK file. So if you have like a VMware server, or if you have VMware Workstation Pro or something like that, you can spin it up there. I mean, you could probably get it working in like VirtualBox or something too, but it probably requires some massaging to do that. So
There is
I've done it before.
Yeah, someone does publish an OVA for it, but there's some tweaking, and I used to do it work out quite good.
okay,
But other people have said that it did work for them, and some said it worked, but they had to tweak a few things. So.
okay. Well, if you know like what had to be tweaked or anything like that, usually there's like discussion forums and all that on the live community. If you just do some searches, you can probably find some how-tos or people who have encountered the same problems that you may be encountering. But Expedition, like once you can get it up and running, it's a great tool to use. And the third option, of course, as a PS consultant, I gotta do a shameless plug here. You could do a PS engagement. You can get us to do it for you. Okay, like Palo Alto Networks and our partners, we're very experienced in doing firewall migrations. I myself have done probably like 30 or 40 of them now in the 2 years that I've worked there, ranging in varying degrees of complexity. Just to give you an idea of like one of the more complex ones I've done, I actually had a very large customer who had 54 Cisco contexts, and they wanted to merge that into one PAN-OS configuration. I successfully did that. So migrations are definitely, we are no stranger to that in Palo Alto Professional Services. So, yes?
So is the idea for these, do you start by doing just the service objects and then later, is that the standard way to do it? You have layer 3 and 4 rules from your old appliance.
Mhm.
And you start with that, and then you turn on the higher level filtering later.
Actually, I'm about to go over that right now.
Okay.
So, so essentially, when it comes to adopting App ID, there's a general methodology that I like to use. So the first thing I like to do, and this is if I'm using, you could use this with any one of the methods really, but what you want to do is you want to clone the port protocol-based policies. You clone those beneath the existing in-place ones. Okay, and the reason you do that is if you connect like your Panorama or your firewall to Expedition, when it does the application, log translation, and it shows what applications have been observed by these policies, it will do it in place. Okay, so the reason you clone these rules is because you want to make sure that the clone is beneath the rule that actually has the logs associated with it. Because when you do the replacement, it'll replace them all in place. So then you don't want to lose your port protocol rules beneath that. The reason we do this, okay, how do firewalls work, right? When it comes to matching policy, top down, exactly. So if you have app ID rules and you had port protocol rules that worked previously, right? The reason you clone the port protocol rules beneath the app ID rules is so you can test the app ID rules. If you had port protocol rules that were working before, you can non-disruptively introduce app ID into your security posture without disrupting traffic. So that's why you clone the rules. So then the other thing you do once you actually connect Expedition to to the rule base there, and you actually have it look at all the apps that were observed, you audit. Okay, simple as that. You read the logs, you look at what applications have been identified, and then you make the determination as a security team. Okay, we see that this particular policy is allowing X, Y, and Z through. Okay, X and Y are supposed to be allowed, but what is Z doing there? So then you can basically start cherry picking what applications you want versus which ones you want to deny. So next, implement it. Okay, so you replace the port protocol rules, the ones that are not cloned, with the app IDs, and my recommendation is to start out with application default, and then you let those port protocol rules take care of anything that doesn't match application default. Okay, and then after that you let it cook. Okay, you basically have that in place for about, usually it's between 30, 60, or 90 days, depending on what your organization's risk tolerance is. Once you have a certain amount of logs, you just take a look at it, and if you start seeing those port protocol rules that are still getting hits, you figure out why, and then you just repeat the process. Starting from the analyze, though, because you've already cloned it. So repeat, analyze, implement, cook until you no longer have port protocol rules that are getting hits. So any questions regarding that presentation so far? At least any questions that have not been asked yet. Yes?
So we have a user internet access policy, and it's essentially just a group of applications that we just maintain manually. But I do know that applications have different categories.
Yes.
Like it's known as transfer files, risk tolerance 1 through 5, behavior, all these things. And I've noticed that you can actually search through, like you can say, my risk tolerance of 4 is acceptable, that exhibits this behavior, and essentially just clusters all of the apps that exhibit that behavior into a list.
Yes. That's an application filter. You can actually make a
filter.
Those are great.
Yeah, you can create an application filter object. So what he's talking about, when it comes to App ID, you can create application groups, and you can also create application filters. Okay, so an application group is a static list of app IDs that you group together. So for instance, I know that my users need access to XYZ and whatever else. You statically make that list of app IDs in the group, and you apply that to your security policy. You can just reference the object group instead of cherry picking each one of those app IDs. You could also make an application filter. So if you actually go to, you guys can all look at this yourselves too. If you go to applepedia.paloaltonetworks.com, that is our app ID database. Okay, it's updated with the most current application signatures. So you notice at the top of that, there's actually a table that has all these characteristics. So an application filter object allows you to essentially make a list of applications based on those characteristics. So for instance, let's say I have my users and they need to access some streaming media sites or whatever. You could actually make the application filter for streaming media and apply that in a security policy, and it would allow anything in that list, in that filter. So
the reason why I brought it up is because we have custom lists, and sometimes there'll be new apps introduced, and the app will get, or the update will get applied to the firewall, and maybe now an application that marketing was using is getting blocked because it's not on the list. So
Yeah,
we're
because
calling
we have our
that
default action to block new applications and content
You
updates.
got to disable new applications? Is that-
Yes.
Okay.
We don't, because we want to vet and see what was released in that particular update. So if, like,
Yeah.
there's been times like in the past where like Facebook just used to be Facebook, but now it's Facebook base, posting, uploading. We don't want to necessarily have that all allowed, or maybe we want to say like, well, people can get there, but we don't want people posting. So we don't want to just automatically introduce functionality.
That may
Because
not have
as
been
the
there.
Palo Alto becomes more advanced, obviously we want to make sure that we're leveraging it and we're not at the same time enabling maybe functionality we didn't want to have publicly available.
Right. So something interesting, based on what you just told me there. So you have it set to disable new applications when you get the updates.
Mhm.
I believe it's 8.1 where this was introduced, but now whenever you're about to apply new application signatures, it'll actually bring up a table that shows you all your security policies that will be affected by the new
Yeah, that
application
was 8.0.
signatures. That was an 8.0? Okay. I've been with the company for a couple of years, so I mean, I learned it on like 7.0. So I mean, like, we introduce features very, very rapidly. So sometimes it's even hard for me to keep track of everything. But that is definitely something to consider looking at if you want to start implementing new app IDs.
And we only implement once a week because we've run into typos with Active Directory stuff
Mhm.
where all of our users started getting denied logins.
Mhm.
So from that we moved to it gets reviewed once a week.
Yeah, and that's why I recommend using like the 48-hour threshold if you do have like the automatic download and install. You're usually fairly safe doing that. But,
Well, and there was a change to the actual App ID update process. So now it's App IDs are updated every month, and you've still got your threat updates that happen weekly. So before it used to be every single week there was apping and threat updates.
Yeah.
Now that's just once a month on the App ID. I think it's on the third Tuesday is when it's typically scheduled. The week after whatever Microsoft says.
Patch Tuesday.
To give everyone time. And then threats still happen weekly or more often if needed.
Yeah. And I saw you had a question?
The new SSH, I guess it's an SSH proxy that they added in the Palo Alto. Does that give you visibility on SSH tunnel applications or no?
When you say SSH, are you talking about the tunnel inspection feature?
Yeah, there's like an SSH proxy that they added in
Yep.
one.
Okay.
No, so we've been able to do SSH decryption
Yeah.
for quite a while. The SSH proxy.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand the SSH proxy because like when it comes
the
to
SSL proxy.
Isn't it the same thing? You get the SSH inspection. It's basically the.
well,
You
there's
do.
tunnel inspection.
Yeah, there is tunnel inspection. That's been there for a while for SSH tunnels.
Yeah. So
that would give you
basically.
visibility on the application.
Yeah, that allows you to see what's
Yeah.
inside that SSH tunnel. So if it's just commands, if it's FTP, whatever the case is.
Well, with tunnel inspection too, doesn't that also break apart like GRE and like some other generic encapsulations as well?
So there is a tunnel inspection for like GRE, and they're looking at a couple other ones, but that inspection requires essentially null encryption.
Yeah.
So if you're not using the actual certificate keys that are going through it, we're able to open that tunnel up and see what's inside of a GRE tunnel. There's a couple other tunnels. I think there was additional features of those that were added in 8.1.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If there's something specific for SSH proxy, I'm gonna have to look into that to see.
I think it's just I think it's in there with the other SSL. This is an SSL proxy as well for the decryption.
So you're just talking about SSL decryption then, right?
Well,
So
it's
because
in
there's.
there now, I think. There's the SSH portion they added in there, I think. So
Yeah, I mean that Ben's right though. That particular feature, like SSH decryption, that has existed since I think like 7.0. I mean it's been in there for a while.
Maybe they moved it. Maybe I just noticed it for the first time. All right.
Okay. And
So if they're releasing it monthly now, you're saying it's 48-hour delay, what's the problem with the app ID? Are they doing out-of-band updates to that then?
well, here's the thing. So if you have an automatic dynamic update schedule, what all it does, that threshold value, it just looks to see how old the update is. So for instance, say a new app ID gets released on like the third Tuesday of whatever week in the month. Your firewall is configured to automatically check and download updates. So if your threshold is 48 hours, if it checks and tries to download that update, and that update is not 48 hours old, it'll skip it. But if your schedule is set to like maybe check daily, it'll check once a day, and then once it checks in and that signature or that app database is 48 hours old, it'll just download it. You'll just get it like 2 days later. Is really what it boils down to.
And that was the reason that was made as part of the QA process, about a year and a half ago, I think, we had updated an SMB decoder. And that SMB decoder, I think that's what counteracted with there was something in the Active Directory decoder, and there was some combination that created a bug and started to consume more memory on the data plane.
Yep.
So we had that resolved in a couple of hours, and we had taken it down once we knew what was going on, re-released it. But as part of that QA process, we want to make sure that we don't break your environments, we don't break your networks. So we changed it to try and provide more QA time for us to be able to test those functionalities, as well as a better time for you to be able to handle those new application updates.
Yeah, we try to give more control to you guys is really what it boils down to. Because, again, nobody likes to have their phones blow up when, because like the vendor released something that breaks their environment. So we give you some control over that. So, any additional questions? Okay, so I know this presentation is primarily centered around App ID, but there was one more thing I wanted to talk about. I wanted to just kind of continue. So Palo Alto Professional Services is doing something called transformation, okay? Because through years of working with our customers, we've noticed a very common trend, and we want to make it so that trend is not common anymore. So as I described earlier, we do a lot of migrations, okay? Like we'll come into an environment, they'll have like an incumbent firewall. The company will buy Palo Alto because, hey, it's we got direction to do it, or hey, we actually like the features, and we'll do the migration. Cutover happens, everything's successful. I go home because I'm a PS consultant. I'm usually there for like a short time period, and then we'll come to find out. We'll hear from the customer again, and we'll look at the rule base. They're still using port protocol rules. Okay, so and say it's like 6 months down the road. Okay, well if you're still using port protocol rules, why did you buy a Palo Alto? Like we have all these additional advanced features to do deep content inspection. We have security profiles, antivirus. We can look for CVE vulnerabilities. We can look for spyware signatures. We have Wildfire, okay? But all the policies that some of our customers do is still port protocol. So really, what our goal in professional services is to work closely with our customers to try to get you guys to adopt all these features. Because they're not just marketing buzzwords. We develop all these features for a reason, and that is to protect our customers' environments much better than they previously could. Okay, we have all these deep content inspection features. You can do like URL filtering. We do a lot of stuff. But we're finding that a lot of our customers, we're not entirely sure why, maybe it's because of like staffing problems, or maybe it's because they just don't know how to do it. But we started creating this thing called the transformation process, okay? Because the features are really not that difficult to implement from a technical perspective, but they may be difficult to implement for you guys because of maybe internal corporate bureaucracy or whatever, or say I've got maybe 3 people that have to manage 3 or 4 different countries worth of sites. So
I would say those are the 2 biggest reasons why we don't. We try to do as much as we can, but there's only so much time in a day when you're managing 40 sites worldwide and there's 2 people in your network and security team.
Exactly, and you got to find that nice work-life balance too. So
yeah.
I love what I do, but at the end of the day, I'm a person and I have a personal life. So if we can help you guys implement all these security features, so you can go home and sleep easy at night, or go home to your families, we're way happy to do that. So really, what we try to do is we came up with this transformation process to try to get our customers to adopt all these security features, and there's various levels of it, okay? So it's a phased approach. We try to work with you guys to first enable visibility. So the first step is almost always a migration. It's policy migration. Take your layer 3, 4 firewall policy, migrate it into PAN-OS, like for like, okay? So as close as we can get it to feature parity with what you had before, you're good to go there. Then we start working with you to try to develop strategies to implement some of these additional features, because they will help you. User ID is fantastic.
Yeah.
User ID helps you lock down not only what systems are allowed to access your environment, but who is allowed to access those these resources. Threat prevention, URL filtering, Wildfire, we can enable those profiles in alerting mode if you guys have cold feet about just blocking stuff right out the gate. Transformation level 2, is all about control. Start controlling your traffic. Start implementing App ID. Start changing your unsanctioned applications to block mode. Start deploying traps in your endpoints. Threat prevention. Also, that endpoint environment, that could also mean global protect. So we can use that to harvest user ID from all your systems. Threat prevention, wildfire, URL filtering, set all that stuff in blocking mode, and then also make an SSL decryption strategy. So then transformation level 3 is enforcement. So basically it kind of piggybacks off of user ID. Once you get user ID implemented and it's 100% accurate, you can really start enforcing stuff. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of like the sales graphic for it. But ultimately, the point I'm trying to make is that we really do want to work with you guys to ensure that you're enabling all these features and you're actually protecting your network better than what was there before. So, Ben, do you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think that that covers it from that standpoint. I will, as a bonus, I'll just take this.
Right.
As a bonus, the way we're trying to help you guys do this is, a while ago, I had sent out a note on the user group message board about utilizing or being a part of the beta of 9.0. So one of the things I'm going to show you here is one of those features, which this is why I want you guys to participate in the beta so we can actually test these and get it so it's production ready faster. I don't know if it logs in here.
I unfortunately don't have any hardware I can currently beta test with, though.
Do we get hardware if we agree to that?
No. No, you do not get hardware with the beta test. There are other ways to get you hardware.
But the lab units are so, expensive. In a way. You get a 220 as a lab unit just to test.
You can do it on the VMs too. I know a while ago there was a bunch of training classes that Cloud Harmonics, which is one of our partners, was offering for VMs. So you can utilize those as well. Maybe this will load, maybe not.
Apparently not.
It's a Wi-Fi problem.
Could be. Let me try this.
Can you ping Google?
Yes, ping Google so they can learn even more information.